Turning our focus now to India's second largest state by GDP, Tamil Nadu, which accounts for about 9% of India's GDP. It recently emerged from elections with the new DMK government at the helm, and in about 2 months' time, the new government will present an amended budget. Let's discuss how with Tamil Nadu's Finance Minister Palanivel Thiaga Rajan, who joins us exclusively from Chennai. Dr. Rajan, good to have you with us. First of all, give us a sense of how the state has been impacted by COVID. Quantify it for us.
Well, I think, we have been devastated economically. The medical costs have been, at a personal level, very high, but at a societal level, not nearly as bad as the rest of India. We had a better medical infrastructure than most, from number of doctors per capita to hospitals to infrastructure. But like every other part of the world, our economy has shrunk for the first time in decades. And we are trying to cope as best as we can with the second wave that is many times the magnitude of the first wave. And we seem to be on the cusp of getting it under control.
Well, the priority right now for most governments is supporting the people, supporting the economy. You're on the cusp of presenting a new budget. What would be the priorities?
Well, I think the important thing for politicians is to marry your economic philosophy with your political philosophy. And in our case, that has always been one of social justice and financial inclusion. So from that perspective, unlike some other state governments or the union government, we have focused a lot about getting cash into the hands of the poorest, weakest sections of society, the unorganized sector that has been disproportionately affected, and to bring demand back up. Now, there are different theories of how one should proceed in such circumstances, but our economic and our political philosophy dovetail when we say try and get demand back up and get spending power back into the hands of the people that have been affected most. So that will reflect in the amended budget. As you know, an original budget or interim budget was already presented by the outgoing government, and we have to amend it.
Dr. Rajan, would you be looking for new revenue streams to meet some of these COVID-related expenses? Your government has stakes in companies like Titan, Ramco Cements. Any interest in selling your stake there?
Yeah, I think we have a structural problem that I've been talking about as an opposition legislator for 5 years, that our revenues as a percentage of our GSDP have dropped dramatically from somewhere around 10.5 states-owned revenues and about 4% in our share from central taxes. We are now down to about 7% in our states-owned revenues and 10.5 and 3.5 or 3 from the central government to the union government. So we have a structural problem that we need to fix. Of course, we need a one-time kind of, restructuring of our debt because the interest burden has become so high. I'm not as worried about the debt burden because we are a large state. We have enormous assets. The state is the biggest owner of land. And as you say, there are easily liquidatable, market valuable assets that we can exit in very efficient and scale transactions if we need to. But my concern is about fixing the structural problem so we don't have this vicious cycle. We have now reached a point in the last 5 years where we are borrowing to cover revenue deficits, and not just revenue deficits, but actual non-discretionary costs like interest payments and salaries. And that is something we cannot sustain. And we will not use asset sales as a substitute. It is only a one-time thing for restructuring. We need to fix the plumbing first. Of course, that's hard to do in the middle of a pandemic, but we will focus on that for the next 5 years of our term.
So how do you improve your liquidity then? I mean, you mentioned that is an issue for the state. If it's not borrowing, what are certain plans that you have for fundraising?
No, I don't think I ever said that liquidity was an issue. A large state like us has almost infinite access to borrowing. We are only at about 25.5%, 26% debt to GDP. So we are a good credit. We are the single largest investment destination for most of the development agencies, both national and multinational. So all I meant was managing liquidity is my first priority. That's any rational person's first priority, is to ensure that your date of issuance of bonds and your payments of coupons and your need for immediate payments of cash as subsidies or grants in the course of a pandemic or for urgent medical expenses or imports. I just meant that that was my priority. I don't think I ever felt that we ever had a liquidity problem. I would say a state of our size has almost infinite liquidity if managed properly. It is the
So just to confirm, Dr. Rajan, there is no need for you to borrow?
No, I didn't say that. I said we can borrow whenever and however we want to. Our overall debt is relatively low as a function of our GDP, and we are a very asset-rich state. So our credit is good. I'm not worried about being cut out of the markets or being unable to raise funds. All I meant was managing the sequence of liquidity is my first priority. That remains. That's for any business, any government, any entity.
Dr. Rajan, what would you like to see from the RBI? How can the RBI help?
Well, the RBI needs to focus a lot more on the demand side and to focus a lot more on facilitating the state's management of their own finances. You know, we are just about to go into the GST Council meeting in a couple of hours. And one of our positions in that meeting is going to be that the Union Government of India, India is a union of states in the Constitution, seems to have, kind of accumulated a disproportionate amount of the financial powers of taxation, of distribution, of rate setting, and starting at an uneven place relative to global standards in terms of excessive centralization, we have gotten even worse over the last 5-6 years, where the fiscal autonomy of states is greatly constrained. And so our worry and our request to both the union government, but also all the institutions like the RBI, is to not tie our hands. We have huge responsibilities. Our states are large. The state of Tamil Nadu is about 80 million people. It's not a small problem. So when you devolve responsibility down to the states, and that's the only way you can execute, even the so-called central schemes cannot be executed by central government officers or contractors. They get done in the states. So this disparity between execution responsibility falling on the states, but fiscal authority going up to the union is something that we want to see, fundamental change in.
And you mentioned about the states and their response. How do you think the response of states like yours to the pandemic will affect investments by multinational companies? Do you think that their decisions will be guided by what states what they do and how they handle this crisis?
Well, as you know, at some level, the sovereign credit rating and the sovereign financial standing kind of shade all of us. At some other level, Tamil Nadu has always been the number one destination state, certainly for multinational agencies like the World Bank, the ADB. Bankers go where the credit is good, where the chances of outcome are good. And decades of our social justice politics and inclusive politics that we call the Dravidian model have clearly kind of resulted in a workforce, infrastructure, a kind of framework that makes us an attractive destination. For example, we have probably the highest percentage English-speaking, college-educated workforce in India as a percentage of population, plus we are a large state. So in that sense, I'm not as worried about investment in the bigger picture. I worry about short-term kind of balancing things and ensuring that we don't stop infrastructure investments, stop laying the groundwork for future investments by global corporates and by our own MSME sector. But I'm much more worried about the medical health consequences and the redistributive problems of a pandemic.
Dr.
Every
Rajan,
disaster, every pandemic inherently exacerbates
we
inequality.
have to leave it there, Dr. Rajan.
I'm worried about that. I'm not worried about...
Tamil Nadu Finance Minister Palanivel Thiaga Rajan. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.